Vermont, 1965. A 5-year-old boy vanishes from a small farming community without a trace. For 6 decades, his family searches desperately. Police find nothing, the case goes cold. Then in 2025, a genealogy DNA test reveals an impossible truth. Alden Price is alive. He's been living under a different name just 2 states away, with no memory of the family that never stopped looking for him. How did 60 years of lies finally unravel through modern science? Stay with us as we uncover this extraordinary story. Hello and welcome to the DNA Archives, where we dive deep into cold cases, missing persons, and the mysteries that DNA finally solves. If you love stories where families are reunited after decades and the truth prevails against all odds, you're in the right place. Please hit the like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss a case. Now let's go back to where this incredible journey began. September 23, 1965, Whitfield, Vermont. It was a small town nestled in the Green Mountains. Population barely 400, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and doors were never locked. Autumn was beginning to settle in, the leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and gold, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The Price family lived on a dairy farm about 2 miles outside of town. They had owned the land for 3 generations, worked it with their own hands. Thomas Price was 38, a quiet man with weathered hands and a strong back. He woke before dawn every day to milk the cows. His wife Margaret was 35. She managed the household, tended the vegetable garden, canned fruits and vegetables for the long Vermont winters. They had 4 children. The oldest was Anna, 13 years old, responsible and serious, already helping with the younger ones. Then came the twins, Samuel and Sarah, both 9. Rambunctious and inseparable, always getting into mischief together. The youngest was Alden, 5 years old, blonde hair that stuck up in the back no matter how much Margaret tried to comb it down. Bright blue eyes full of curiosity. Alden was small for his age, quiet like his father. He loved following Thomas around the farm, asking endless questions about the cows, the chickens, the tractors. That Thursday morning was like any other. Thomas left the house at 4:30 to start the morning milking. Margaret made breakfast for the children at 6. Alden ate his oatmeal slowly, watching out the kitchen window as the sun began to rise over the mountains. After breakfast, Anna walked to the main road to catch the school bus. The twins followed behind her. Alden was too young for school yet. He stayed home with Margaret, usually played in the yard while she did laundry or worked in the garden. Around 9 o'clock, Margaret was hanging sheets on the clothesline in the backyard. Alden was playing nearby with his toy trucks in the dirt. She could hear him making engine noises, talking to himself the way children do when they play alone. The phone rang inside the house. It was Margaret's sister calling from town. They talked for maybe 10 minutes about plans for Sunday dinner. When Margaret came back outside, the sheets still flapping in the breeze, Alden was gone. At first, she wasn't worried. He had probably wandered toward the barn to find his father. "Margaret," she called out, "Alden, where are you?" No answer. She walked to the barn, found Thomas fixing a fence post. "Is Alden with you?" Thomas looked up, confused. "No, I thought he was with you." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She ran back to the house, checked every room, called his name. Thomas came running. They split up. He searched the outbuildings, the equipment shed, the chicken coop. Margaret checked the vegetable garden, the root cellar behind the wood pile. No Alden. They searched the fields, calling his name, their voices growing more desperate with each passing minute. Thomas got in his truck, drove slowly down the dirt road that led to their property, looking in ditches, checking the woods on either side. Nothing. By 11 o'clock, Margaret called the town constable, a man named Harold Briggs who had known the family for years. Constable Briggs arrived within 20 minutes. He organized a search party. Neighbors came from surrounding farms. People from town volunteered. By afternoon, over 100 people were combing through the woods, the fields along the creek that ran through the property. Search dogs were brought in from Burlington. They picked up Alden's scent in the yard, tracked it toward the road, then lost it. Someone suggested Alden might have wandered into the woods and gotten lost. Vermont forests are dense. Easy for a small child to become disoriented. The search continued through the night. Flashlights bobbing in the darkness, voices calling Alden's name until they were hoarse. By morning, there was still no trace of him. State police were called in. They questioned the family, the neighbors, anyone who had been near the farm that day. One farmer mentioned seeing a blue sedan on the main road around 9:30. Unusual because most people in Whitfield drove trucks or station wagons. He didn't get a license plate, didn't see who was driving, just remembered thinking it looked out of place. Police searched for the blue sedan. Checked with car rental companies, asked around neighboring towns. No leads. By the end of the week, Alden's photo was in newspapers across Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York. A blonde 5-year-old boy, last seen wearing denim overalls and a red flannel shirt, missing from a farm in Whitfield. Tips came in, sightings from as far as Boston and Montreal, but none of them were Alden. Margaret stopped sleeping. She would sit by the window at night watching the driveway, convinced Alden would come walking up the road. Thomas continued working the farm because the cows still needed milking, but his heart wasn't in it. His hands moved mechanically while his mind churned with questions. Anna took care of the twins, tried to keep them calm, tried to be strong even though she was just 13 and terrified. And Alden Price was gone. The first month was consumed by searching and waiting. Volunteers continued combing the woods for weeks. State police followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. The FBI was consulted about possible kidnapping scenarios. But Vermont in 1965 was rural, isolated. There were no security cameras, no Amber Alerts, no databases to cross-reference. Just word of mouth, newspaper photos, and desperate hope. By November, when the first snow began to fall, the organized searches stopped. The woods were too dense, the weather too harsh. Constable Briggs promised the Prices he would never close the case. But Margaret could see in his eyes that he thought Alden had perished in the woods, that spring thaw would reveal his body. Margaret refused to believe it. She felt in her bones that Alden was alive somewhere, that he hadn't wandered into the forest and died alone. A mother knows, she would say to anyone who would listen. He's out there and he needs me to find him. Thomas wasn't so sure. The rational part of him, the practical farmer part, told him that a 5-year-old couldn't survive alone in the Vermont wilderness. But he supported Margaret's hope because without it, she would completely fall apart. By 1966, 1 year had passed. Life on the farm had to continue. Cows still needed milking, crops still needed planting, bills still needed paying. Anna was 14 now, helping more with household duties because Margaret was barely functional. She had lost 30 pounds, stopped caring about her appearance, spent hours every day staring at Alden's photo. The twins, now 10, had nightmares about their little brother. They would wake up crying, saying they heard him calling for them in the woods. Thomas hired a farmhand to help with the work because he couldn't keep up alone. The man was kind, never asked about Alden, just did his job quietly. Every few months, Margaret would get a phone call, someone claiming to have seen a boy matching Alden's description. She would drop everything, drive hours to investigate. Every single time it wasn't him. By 1970, 5 years had passed. Alden would have been 10 years old, starting to look like a young man rather than a little boy. Margaret kept a sketch artist's rendering of what Alden might look like at different ages. She updated it every year, distributed new flyers throughout New England. But the world was moving on. People stopped remembering the missing farm boy from Whitfield. Newer tragedies replaced older ones in the newspapers. Thomas's health began to decline. The stress and grief had taken a physical toll. He developed heart problems. His doctor warned him to slow down. But how do you slow down when there's a farm to run and a missing child to find? Anna left for college in 1972. She felt guilty for leaving, but she needed to escape the suffocating sadness of the farm. The twins graduated high school in 1974. Samuel enlisted in the Army. Sarah moved to Burlington to work as a nurse, both of them running from the ghost of their little brother. By 1980, 15 years had passed. Margaret was 50 years old, her hair completely white, her hands shaking from anxiety medication she took daily. She had converted Alden's bedroom into a shrine, his toys arranged exactly as they had been, his clothes still in the dresser, photos covering every wall. She would sit in there for hours talking to him, telling him about the farm, about his siblings, begging him to come home. Thomas worried she was losing her grip on reality, but what could he do? Grief has no timeline, no rules, no proper way to process. In 1985, 20 years after Alden disappeared, Thomas suffered a massive heart attack while working in the barn. He survived, but barely. The doctor said his heart was failing, he had maybe 5 years left. Thomas made Margaret promise that when he died, she would finally let go of the search, that she would try to live what remained of her life. Margaret promised, but they both knew it was a lie. Thomas died in 1989. He was 62 years old. He never knew what happened to his youngest son. He went to his grave carrying that burden. At his funeral, Margaret stood at the casket and whispered, "Find him, Thomas, wherever you are now. Find our boy and bring him home." The farm was sold in 1990. Margaret couldn't maintain it alone. She moved into a small apartment in town, took the shrine with her, recreated Alden's room and a spare bedroom. Anna visited when she could. She had her own family now. 3 children who never met their Uncle Alden but knew his story by heart. The twins came home for holidays. They were middle-aged now. Samuel had retired from the military. Sarah was a head nurse at a hospital in Burlington. They all carried Alden's absence differently, but they all carried it. By 2000, 35 years had passed. Margaret was 70 years old, her memory starting to fade, her body weakening. She still kept Alden's room, still looked at his photos, but the sharp edge of grief had dulled into a constant ache she had learned to live with. In 2010, Margaret was diagnosed with dementia. Anna moved her into an assisted living facility, finally dismantled the shrine after 45 years. Margaret didn't notice. Most days she didn't remember she had a son named Alden. Some days she didn't remember her own name. She passed away in 2015. She was 85 years old. She died without ever knowing what happened to her youngest child. Anna scattered her mother's ashes on the old farm property, now owned by strangers. She whispered a prayer that Margaret and Thomas had finally found peace, and that somewhere, somehow, Alden knew he had been loved. By 2020, 55 years had passed since Alden disappeared. Anna was 68, Samuel was 64, Sarah was 64. They had all moved on with their lives, had families, careers, grandchildren. But Alden was always there in the background, the missing piece. Then in early 2024, something extraordinary happened that would change everything. To understand how this story ends, we need to step into the life of a man who has lived 60 years under a different name, with no memory of a farm in Vermont, or a family that never stopped searching. In Maine, there lived a man named David Fletcher. He was 65 years old in 2024, a retired postal worker living in a modest house in Portland. David had lived what he considered a normal, unremarkable life. He grew up in Portland, or so he was told, raised by a woman named Ruth Fletcher, who he believed was his mother. Ruth was a solitary woman. She worked as a seamstress, never married, never talked about David's father except to say he had left before David was born. David accepted this story because he had no reason not to. Children believe what they're told, especially when there's no evidence to the contrary. Ruth homeschooled David until he was 8, then enrolled him in public school under the name David Fletcher. She had all the necessary paperwork, birth certificate, immunization records. David was a quiet child. He struggled to make friends, always felt like something was missing but couldn't articulate what. He had vague memories from early childhood, fragments that didn't quite make sense, memories of wide open spaces, of animal sounds, of a woman's voice that didn't match Ruth's. But when he asked Ruth about these memories, she would get upset, tell him he was confusing dreams with reality, that he had always lived in Portland. David learned to stop asking. He grew up, graduated high school in 1977, got a job with the Postal Service, married a woman named Ellen in 1982. They had 2 children, a son named Michael and a daughter named Christine. It was a good life, stable, predictable. David was a devoted father, a reliable husband, a respected member of his community. Ruth passed away in 2005. She was 78 years old. On her deathbed, she seemed like she wanted to tell David something. She kept reaching for his hand, whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." David assumed she was apologizing for dying. For leaving him, he never imagined she was apologizing for something far more profound. After Ruth died, David found a lockbox in her closet. Inside were documents, birth certificates, newspaper clippings, photos. One of the birth certificates had his name, David Fletcher, but the date was wrong. It said 1960. He was born in 1960, not 1965. David was confused. He asked his wife Ellen what she thought. She suggested it might be a clerical error, that birth records in the 1960s were often inaccurate. He accepted that explanation, filed the lockbox away, tried not to think about it. David retired from the Postal Service in 2020. He spent his days gardening, reading, playing with his grandchildren. Ellen had passed away from cancer in 2018. He was lonely but content. Then in March 2024, David's daughter Christine gave him a gift for his birthday, a DNA ancestry test. "Dad, you've always wondered about your heritage, about where your father's side came from. Maybe this will give you some answers." David was hesitant. He didn't care much about genealogy, but Christine was excited about it. She had done her own test and found distant cousins. To make her happy, David spit in the tube, mailed it off, forgot about it. 8 weeks later, the results came back. David opened the email, expected to see percentages of Irish or German or whatever his ancestry might be. What he saw instead made his hands start shaking. The ancestry breakdown was there, but what caught his attention was the DNA matches section. There was a close match, someone who shared 25% of his DNA. The relationship category said niece or aunt. The name was Anna Whitmore, formerly Anna Price. She lived in Burlington, Vermont. David had never heard of Anna Whitmore, had never been to Burlington, had no known relatives in Vermont. He clicked on her profile. She had posted a family tree. At the top were names Thomas Price and Margaret Price. Below them were 4 children, Anna, Samuel, Sarah, and Alden. Alden's entry had a note missing since 1965, presumed deceased. David stared at the screen, his heart pounding. There was a photo attached to Alden's entry, a small blonde boy with bright blue eyes. David got up, walked to his bedroom, pulled out an old photo album, found a picture of himself as a child that Ruth had kept. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the same face shape, the same expression. He sat down heavily on the bed, his mind racing. This was impossible. Ruth was his mother. He was David Fletcher. He had always been David Fletcher. But the DNA didn't lie. David called Christine, his voice shaking. "I need you to come over. Something's wrong with this DNA test." Christine came immediately, looked at the results, looked at the family tree, looked at the photo of Alden Price. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think you need to contact this Anna person." David was terrified. What if this was all a mistake? What if he contacted her and destroyed some family's hope? What if he contacted her and destroyed his own sense of identity? But he had to know. That evening, David sent a message through the DNA website to Anna Whitmore. "Hello, my name is David Fletcher. I recently took a DNA test and it shows we're closely related. I don't understand how this is possible. I've lived in Maine my entire life. Would you be willing to talk?" He hit send, then sat staring at the screen waiting. 3 days later, Anna responded. Anna's response was brief but emotional. She gave David her phone number and asked him to call as soon as possible. David stared at the number for an hour before he had the courage to dial. His hands were shaking so badly he had to try 3 times. Anna answered on the first ring, her voice trembling. "Hello?" David's throat was tight. "This is David Fletcher. I sent you the message about the DNA test." Anna let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "Oh my God, I've been waiting 60 years for this call." David didn't understand. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I don't know how we're related. I've never been to Vermont." Anna's voice was gentle but urgent. "David, I need to ask you something. When is your birthday?" David frowned. "May 15th, 1960. Why?" Anna was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "The DNA says you're my nephew. That means you'd be my brother's child or my sister's child, but none of us had children that early." She paused, then continued, "But I had a younger brother who disappeared in 1965. His name was Alden. He was 5 years old, born in April 1960. David felt the room spin. "That's impossible. I'm David Fletcher. I was born in Portland. I lived there my whole life." Anna's voice cracked. "Can you tell me anything about your childhood? Do you have early memories? Do you remember your mother?" David thought about Ruth, about the fragments of memory he had always dismissed, about the lockbox with the wrong birth certificate. "My mother's name was Ruth Fletcher. She died in 2005. She raised me alone. I don't remember my father." Anna asked another question. "Did your mother ever talk about Vermont, about farms, about why she moved to Maine?" "No," David said. "She never talked about the past at all. Whenever I asked, she would change the subject." Anna took a deep breath. "David, I think you might be my brother Alden. I think someone took you from our farm 60 years ago and raised you as their own child." David wanted to argue, wanted to say it was crazy, but the DNA didn't lie, the numbers didn't lie. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. Anna's voice was steady now. "We contact the police, we get official DNA testing done, we find out the truth." Within a week, Vermont State Police were involved. Detective James Morrison was assigned to the case. He was young, but he had experience with cold cases. He arranged for David to provide a DNA sample that would be compared against old evidence from Alden Price's disappearance, a blanket that had been kept in storage for 60 years. David drove to Vermont, met Anna in person for the first time. When she opened the door and saw him, she burst into tears. "You have Dad's eyes, you have his exact eyes." David looked at photos of Thomas and Margaret, studied their faces, tried to see himself in them. Anna showed him pictures of the farm, of the twins, of herself as a teenager. She told him stories about the day he disappeared. You were playing in the yard. Mom went inside to answer the phone. When she came back, you were gone. David listened, feeling like he was hearing about someone else's life, not his own. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later. They were definitive. David Fletcher was Alden Price. The match to the blanket was 99.9%. There was no doubt. Detective Morrison began investigating Ruth Fletcher's background. What he found was disturbing. Ruth Fletcher's real name was Ruth Donovan. She had worked as a housekeeper in Burlington, Vermont in the early 1960s, just 40 miles from Whitfield. In 1964, she had a daughter who died at birth. The trauma sent her into a deep depression. She was hospitalized for several months. When she was released in early 1965, she quit her job, told people she was moving to Maine to start over. Detective Morrison theorized that Ruth had been driving through Whitfield that September day, had seen Alden playing alone in the yard, had impulsively taken him. She had created a false identity for him, forged documents, moved to Portland where no one knew her, and raised him as her own son. The blue sedan that a farmer had reported seeing near the Price farm in 1965, Ruth had owned a blue Plymouth Valiant. The records confirmed it. David felt sick. The woman he had called mother his entire life, the woman who had read him bedtime stories and packed his school lunches, had kidnapped him. Anna held his hand. This isn't your fault. You were a child. You had no way of knowing. Samuel and Sarah were contacted. They flew to Vermont immediately. The reunion was emotional and strange. They were meeting their baby brother, who was now a 65-year-old man. Samuel hugged David tightly. I've thought about you every single day for 60 years. Sarah cried, touching David's face like she couldn't believe he was real. Mom would have been so happy. She never gave up on you. David struggled with his identity. He had been David Fletcher for 60 years. That was the only life he knew, the only name he responded to. But he was also Alden Price, a farm boy from Vermont who had been stolen and erased. Who am I supposed to be now? He asked Anna quietly. Anna smiled through tears. You're both. You're the person you became and the person you were meant to be. You don't have to choose. The case received massive media attention. The boy who disappeared in 1965 found alive 60 years later, raised under a different name just 2 states away. Experts were brought in to help David process the trauma of discovering his entire childhood was based on a lie. His children, Michael and Christine, supported him completely. They were shocked but determined to help their father navigate this impossible situation. The old Price farm was long gone, sold and subdivided, but Anna took David to the property, showed him where the house had been, where the barn stood. David stood in the field, closed his eyes, tried to remember, and for the first time in 60 years, fragments began to surface. A woman's voice singing, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of cows. It was faint, like a dream, but it was there. I think I remember, he whispered. I think I remember her. It has been over a year since David Fletcher discovered he was Alden Price. Over a year since a simple DNA test unraveled 60 years of lies and reunited a family that had been torn apart. The journey hasn't been easy. Identity is complicated when you've lived your entire life as someone you're not. David still goes by David. It's the name he's known for 6 decades, the name his children call him, the name that feels like home. But he's also reclaimed Alden. He uses both names now, acknowledges both identities, honors both the life he lived and the life that was stolen from him. He splits his time between Maine and Vermont now. He bought a small house near Burlington to be closer to Anna, Samuel, and Sarah. The 4 siblings have built a relationship that defies the lost years. They have Sunday dinners together. They share stories. They fill in the gaps. Anna tells David about their parents, about Margaret's unwavering belief that he was alive, about Thomas working himself to death while carrying the weight of loss. I wish I could have known them, David says often, his voice heavy with regret. Anna always responds the same way. They knew you. They loved you every single day, and wherever they are now, they know you're home. Samuel has become David's closest confidant. They're both veterans of different kinds of wars. They understand each other's quiet grief. Sarah helps David process the psychological trauma. She's a nurse, but she's also the sister who remembers him as a little boy, who can validate the fragments of memory that surface. David's children, Michael and Christine, have embraced their Vermont family. They call Anna aunt. They bring their own children to family gatherings. The grandchildren are fascinated by the story. They ask endless questions about DNA, about how their grandfather was found, about what it feels like to discover you're someone else. David tells them the truth. It feels strange and wonderful and sad all at once, but mostly it feels like finally understanding why I always felt like something was missing. The case sparked national conversation about the power of genealogy DNA testing, about how technology is solving decades-old mysteries. Vermont created a DNA database specifically for cold missing persons cases, requiring all unidentified remains and unsolved disappearances to be entered and cross-referenced annually. The legislation is called Alden's Law, ensuring his story helps other families find answers. Anna was invited to the signing ceremony. She stood beside the governor holding a photo of 5-year-old Alden, the same photo that had appeared on missing posters 60 years ago. "This is for every family still searching," she said. "For everyone who refuses to give up hope. For every person who deserves to know their true identity." David attended the ceremony too. It was surreal standing there as the symbol of hope, as the miracle case. When inside, he still felt like the confused man trying to reconcile 2 lifetimes. Therapy has helped. David sees a counselor who specializes in identity trauma. They work through the complicated feelings about Ruth. "She kidnapped me," David says in sessions. "She stole my entire life. But she also loved me, she raised me, she was the only mother I knew." His therapist reminds him that both things can be true, that grief is complicated, that he's allowed to mourn the woman who raised him, even while acknowledging the terrible thing she did. David visits Ruth's grave sometimes, stands there with conflicting emotions. He brings flowers, but also brings anger. "Why did you do it?" he asks the headstone. "Why did you take me? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" The answers died with Ruth. But David has made peace with that. Some questions will never be answered, and that's okay. The old Price family plot is in a cemetery outside Whitfield. Thomas and Margaret are buried there along with generations of Prices before them. David visits their graves often now, talks to the parents he never got to know. "I'm sorry I didn't come home sooner," he tells them. "I'm sorry you spent your whole lives searching, but I'm here now." And Anna says, "You would have loved the man I became." A memorial bench was placed at the site where the old Price farm used to be. It has a plaque that reads, "In memory of the Price family and all families separated by tragedy, may love always find a way home." David sits on that bench regularly, trying to absorb the history, trying to feel connected to a place he doesn't remember but somehow feels familiar. Anna sits with him sometimes. She's 73 now, grateful every day that she got her brother back before it was too late. "We lost so much time," she says, "but we have time now, and that's what matters." DNA doesn't forget, even when memory does, even when 60 years pass and identities are erased, even when the truth is buried under lies, DNA remembers. And because of that, families can be reunited, stolen children can find their way home, and the truth can emerge no matter how long it's been hidden. Alden Price's story is a reminder that it's never too late, that hope should never be abandoned, that science can work miracles, and that family is worth searching for no matter how many decades have passed. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us continue bringing extraordinary stories like Alden's to light. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, tell us how this case impacted you. We read every single one and cherish this community. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the DNA Archives. We're committed to bringing you more incredible cold cases, more mysteries solved through DNA, more stories of hope, reunion, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in the power of truth, and remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries have the most beautiful solutions. We'll see you in the next case.